Welcome. My name is Kate Hodges. I'm the Assistant Town Manager, and this evening is our second public forum related to the new park parcel off Commonwealth Avenue, which we're referring to as Gerow Park. We held our first meeting on August 25th at the Gerow Park site, and many of you were present for that. But those who were not, I can tell you that our consultants from GPI conducted a comprehensive site walk and spoke at length about existing conditions and touching on over a dozen topics, including access, current invasive species, the need for open space, the beautiful views, the pond's edge, parking, and the connections to the existing and still under construction Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. Following the site walk, Ron Hedrick, who serves as our project manager, who is also here this evening, showed a preliminary concept design, which is here, illustrated on how the park would build upon the current existing site features as well as handle some of the constraints. The majority of the attendees who were there at the meeting provided comments and thoughts regarding programming, site amenities they'd like to see, and other questions that were related to the overall property. So this evening we have our consultants from Greenman Peterson, which is GPI, who was the town's chosen engineering, design, and planning firm, with us to provide an update and show you some designs, some updated designs that build off of this, but also build in some of the comments that we received from the first meeting. So I'd like the opportunity to either introduce or reintroduce you to Ron Hedrick, our project manager, and Bonnie Ewing, is she here? Oh, there she is, the landscape designer, and Kristen Sabaski, I'm sorry, who's the environmental sub-consultant from the ESS group, who is currently working with the town through the Natural Resources Division on the Warner's Pond assessment and dredging feasibility, but also is a sub-consultant of GPI for this particular project. So I'd like to welcome Ron up to go over some new developments.
Well, good evening, everyone. Hopefully, if it's not a spoiler alert, maybe somebody will give us Red Sox updates throughout the evening. I know where they were when I looked last. I'm going to try to keep my presentation to about 15 or 20 minutes. I got about 30 slides to get through. But the first thing we want to start with is a little video clip we took. We had our drone pilot go out and fly a quick sort of perspective from the water looking back. I thought it'd be an interesting thing for folks to see. If you were at the site walk, if you've been on site, you know that there's a lot of trees out there. There's different areas along the parcel. I'm going to get into that a little bit in my discussion, how there's sort of segments that are different in character, but wanted you to see it from the water and sort of highlight some of the different areas. So if you could roll that, Kate. Exception is starting kind of here is at the Cove, this little arc in the shoreline where the land comes down very close to the water elevation, so it makes it a great access point. And then sort of the last kind of the forgotten third is this forested ridge area. It's very pronounced hillside, and then the property is out by that lone tree there. So I wanted to give you kind of that. We wanted to kind of see what that looked like. It didn't show the shoreline as much as I hoped it would. but you can see how heavily vegetated the site is. So we can go to the PowerPoint now. Yeah, we were joking that we're going to bring a lot of fill in for that. Yeah. Awesome. All right, so tonight's program, I got kind of 4 areas I want to talk about. The project context, I want to talk a little bit about some of the existing features, wanted to kind of describe some of the major project components we've been looking at, and then I want to get into the conceptual options, and then finally we'll have an open discussion about what you've seen and questions you might have. First slide is an aerial. I think everybody's probably familiar with the site. If you're not, it's located near the Route 2 Rotary, MCI Concord. It's kind of tucked back. It's a little hard to see the pond, actually. I've been through Concord a number of times, and this was sort of my first sort of awareness of it when this project came out. You can see in orange the parcel. It's a 7-acre parcel, just over 7 acres that the town has purchased for recreational use. It's got about 1,500 linear feet of shoreline. It's tremendous views of the pond from the project. The pond itself is about 54 acres if you count the islands. So it's quite a resource to be next to. And the site is about 0.6 miles from downtown West Concord, which is probably about a 12-minute walk along the rail trail. So it's going to be a great asset that everybody can walk or bike to from West Concord, or certainly visit from other parts of town. So here's an aerial of the site. You see that there's not a lot going on there currently. We've got the one residential house, the old Gerow house. There's a driveway that comes in from Commonwealth in here. It's just under halfway into the site. You can see kind of different vegetation zones, and I'm going to kind of run through those. So you've got kind of what I call the driveway sequence coming in. There's some scattered hardwood trees there, but there's also a lot of dense shrubbery layers, a lot of invasives in there, bittersweet, honeysuckle, different things growing up the trees. So that's an area that I think over time we'll want to try to treat. Probably some of that is just simply removing some of that vegetation layer, maybe mowing it like what happens in the lawn section. The second area there is the house lot, which is predominantly a mown lawn. It's fairly nice in terms of it's the understory's kept down. The trees around the house are nice. There's a few ornamentals there, like a Japanese maple. There's also an arborvitae hedge that kind of screens the driveway off from the house. The third segment there is the pine forest. That's very dense. In a forestry term, it's what you see there is it's the stem exclusion phase of sort of this forested pine where there's no understory. Everything's dead underneath because it's light starved. And so it shows that it's sort of in its second phase. And that's indicative of, at one point, a lot of the site had been disturbed. I think originally the Gerows, and if you were at the site walk, I handed out an old subdivision map. At one point, I think they had plans to subdivide the lot and put houses on it. And for one reason or another, that never occurred, much to the benefit of the town and where we are now. And then finally, the fourth kind of segment there is that forested ridge. If you've been out there, you know it's probably rises about 15 feet very quickly from the water to the top of that, and then proceeds to drop right back down to the agricultural fields, which actually, if you go up there, gives you a very nice perspective of the pond. If you can find gaps in the trees, that's where we find some of the oldest and largest hardwood. It's because I don't think that area ever was disturbed like most of the site. And then the blue arrow is pointing out just that cove area that was mentioned in the video. I'm going to go through some of these pretty quick. We've done a site analysis, kind of breaking everything into layers, looking at different aspects, physical aspects, environmental. This one is topography and drainage, and I thought this one was important to show because on this, we're highlighting with the hatching, these green hatched areas are the steep slopes, and you can kind of see how those tend to, I think the one real challenge of this site is with so much shoreline that's so steep, and I'm talking about 15, 16 feet in rise along the area in front of the house and through here, how you get people down to the pond, which is a natural attraction, without destroying and eroding those banks. Another thing you'll see in this, these arrows are indicating these are high points where water is shedding either side. These are the drainage divides. And you see there's a kind of a natural low point sort of back through here, which is pretty much aligned with the driveway going down into the woods and discharging out at the Cove area. So that's something that the site really needs to respect in terms of that natural drainage pattern. That's where all the water wants to go and discharge. So we have to be careful about preserving the aspects and the functions of that. And then finally, this red arrow here is showing the existing slope, which is important. The gradient of the ground there, in terms of accessibility, it sort of suggests where we might be able to get accessible connections down to the water, which is obviously an important part of a public project. And just as a comparison, you can see right here, I can't see that myself, 8% here, which is at the very maximum of accessible grades, whereas this is about 3.3. So it suggests there's a very kind of natural line down through here that we could put a path and meet accessibility. So those are kind of three key things that have come out of sort of an analysis of the topography and of the drainage. This one shows the existing driveway going in, and if you were at the site walk, if you go back into the woods, there are remnants of a road that was put through here, or at least the start of a road, and I think that was it was rough graded for the subdivision, never occurred, but nonetheless, that there's been some work done there that we could benefit from. And this is, you can see by the sort of the density of the contours, is a gravel pit area. A lot of this project site is very sandy, so I think at some point it either appealed to the railroad or someone else, and some sand was taken out of here and probably sold or used to construct the railroad. This one shows the Bruce Freeman in blue, Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. The solid is the part that's been built under Phase 3C. 2B is in the works, and that's in the dashed line. We've got sort of this new pedestrian crossing here with wheelchair ramps. It's all being put in it's accessible standards, meeting accessible standards. We've got sidewalks along Commonwealth, but beyond that, there's no real pedestrian facilities within the site. This one shows the resource areas along the pond. To date, we haven't found any wetlands per se within the site, vegetated wetlands, but there are other resource areas under the Wetlands Act that we have to respect, including land underwater, anything underneath the body of the pond, and what's called bank. And so we've kind of outlined what we think is the limit of bank along the pond here. And the wetlands regulations, they apply a 100-foot buffer to that any work within 100 feet of that bank will have to be, reviewed. But also then there's a local bylaw for a 25-foot no disturb, and then a 50-foot no build that the town has that applies to this. So those are all things that, in conjunction with the steep slopes, kind of restrict what we can or cannot do along the shoreline of the pond. A couple of maps that ESS had prepared here, a couple of graphics they prepared for their watershed management study. The one in blue on the left shows, it's a bathymetry map showing the depth of the water. The one on the right is an isopac diagram showing sediment depth. The darker the colors, that means the deeper they are. So this here is the deepest area currently within the pond. Gets to, I think it was about 9 or 8 or 9 feet, if I remember correctly. Correspondingly, you can kind of see over here, just in a similar location, some of the deepest sediments. And one of the things we've come to realize is there's an existing outfall pipe that comes from over, from the other side of Route 2, from some of the agricultural fields, that discharges into the pond. And we believe that this deep area here is a result of the scour caused by that pond, that it actually keeps flushing the area out, and that potentially that sediment, that depth of sediment next to it is from that same action. But you can see, and this is what Kristen's firm has been working on, addressing the overall health of the pond, which is you're getting sediments coming in with Neshoba Brook and basically filling the pond. Just a collection of some images. There's lots of great pictures out here, great views. Some of them are stunning, like the big one on the lower left, looking from sort of the house site out into the pond. Others that are internal kind of views, looking into the woods, looking out from the woods, looking along the driveway. These are all things that we want to consider as we design this park, in some cases enhance those views. This one's a little hard to read, but just a collection of the utilities that were out here. There's overhead power that comes in, serves the house. There's 2 drain lines that kind of pass through the site. One here coming, just clipping the corner of the project area, coming off Commonwealth, and the other one I mentioned that goes out to Route 2 and beyond Route 2. I think I mentioned at the last site walk that we were looking at whether, the town asked if that line could be changed as part of the Bruce Freeman project, which my firm is actually also working on. But it was concluded that the line is so deep that it wouldn't be effective to try to daylight it or do something with it within the park. It would just be too much disruption. So it was decided that work would probably be handled in a later project as part of the Route 2 Rotary project, which is down the line. So it seemed like a more natural thing to do because it is a state-owned drain line. There is no sewer on site. The house is currently on septic, and I think it's on well water, if I'm not mistaken, but water would be a consideration we'll have. And there was an old line of sewer lines, but these were all for the houses that used to be along Commonwealth, most of which have been removed, and presumably the sewer is now gone. So we broke, my font changed a little there. Want to accent the W. So we broke the project into 5 major components, which kind of broad headings that we use to consolidate things, kind of, put them in folders, if you will. And everything kind of lays under these. So let me get to my page so I can read them all. So the 5 include environment. Obviously, we've got this beautiful site next to the pond. It's a sensitive site, but there's environmental, both the aesthetic issues as well as the functional issues of the environment there. We've got the planned activities that we'll be putting into the park. We've got circulation that includes vehicle and pedestrian. We've got structures to deal with, including the existing house that's there, as well as proposed structures that would probably include a restroom facility, maybe some shelters or pavilions. And we're talking about potentially some fishing piers and or boardwalks along the shoreline, and then the infrastructure, as I was just talking about, the electric, the water, the sewer. So I want to go through those real quick. First, the environment. I think these are pretty self-explanatory, but the open space, we want to reinforce the open space parts of this. And one of the things I emphasized early in this project is a large part of the 7 acres is forested, so that makes the open space, that is the pieces that aren't all trees, even more important, because those are very useful for recreational purposes. So we want to really reinforce and improve those areas, where the house lot is and coming in along the driveway. We want to, over time, clear out invasive species as best as possible. That's not an easy task. There are strategies to doing that, and sometimes you have to just kind of pick and choose how you go about that. There's the forested areas. As I mentioned, sort of that centerpiece is a pine forest. That's nearing probably the end of its phase in terms of its darkness, but as we start to do work here, we'll probably end up opening portions of that up, letting some light in, and you'll start to see understory start to reemerge. It's kind of a natural progression, and I think raising tree canopy through some of those areas so people don't get a stick in the eye kind of a thing will be one of the things that's a part of the project. There's the shoreline area, which, as I mentioned before, we want to protect from erosion. There are going to be places where we'll want to open views to the water as well. And then there's kind of this cove area or beach area where the town is looking to create kind of a hand-carried beach boat launch area. In terms of activities, just some photos kind of illustrating sort of the seasonal activities that can occur here. Lots of active things that would occur. Some of these would be programs, some of them would be informal. Boating, paddleboarding, biking certainly as a way to get there. A playground was something we heard at the last meeting that we've included into this. Everyone saw that as a piece of the program that needed to be in there. Certainly things like ice skating in the winter. And then swimming was one of those things that was talked a lot about at the last meeting. I think we're calling it future right now because I think there's a lot of pond hurdles that need to be overcome first. First, the dredging, the removal of that storm line is seen as an essential part of a swimming beach. And so swimming is one of those things that might be down the line for this park. Passive activities, walking, fishing, just natural enjoyment, getting out there, enjoying the sunshine and the views. And then gathering areas so that people can have events there, pavilions that might be you'd sign up for and have a family gathering, birthdays, that sort of thing. Circulation is a big part of a project like this, making sure you can get people in, making sure that the areas are accessible to the public as is required, making sure it handles the amount of people that may come here, which is sort of a balance of how much room do you have to how many people you can accommodate. And parking is in boat drop-off or other components of that parking needs to you need to be able to get in and park your car, but we don't want to overwhelm the site with parking. But also, you need to be able to get in and turn your car around. And certainly, if there's boat launching, you need to be able to drop your boat off and then turn your car around and park. So those are all components of this. And this diagram here simply shows that we've evaluated about 4 or 5 different alternatives along Commonwealth, recognizing that the existing driveway has a lot of problems with it. It dips down real quick going in. It's at a skewed alignment to Commonwealth. And probably its worst feature is that it ends up being very, very close to the Bruce Freeman crossing at Commonwealth, which we really saw as a problem. So we've looked at a number of alternatives, and this one has really risen to the top as this new parking area has a curb. They've put in just finishing it actually, but they've put in a curb cut here, and we would bring an access road just off of that across the trail down and then reconnect with the existing driveway alignment. What that does for us is it potentially opens up the front of this lot for the affordable housing component of this. That hasn't been, I think, decided on yet, but that's a possibility. One of the recognitions is the Bruce Freeman corridor is still owned by the state. The town has a 99-year lease on it, and so we'll need an easement to get across the Bruce Freeman Trail to get into the park. So that will probably be tied to the 99-year lease. So the stipulations of any affordable housing will kind of want to be on a similar timeline, I would think, to ensure that the park doesn't potentially lose frontage if it, say, 30 years, the state all of a sudden says, we want our rail corridor back, which is very unlikely. But And this is just a picture showing you about where that would cross. There was a detention basin area put in here as part of the parking lot, which we would need to modify to accommodate the new driveway alignment. But we feel that location is far superior to where the existing driveway comes out. And it's got better sight lines, and the alignment would be better. And it's much further away from the trail. Here's a shot in the woods. As I mentioned, it's hard. You go into the woods with a camera, it's hard to get great pictures. But you can kind of see the bump in the ground right here. And this is that old road alignment. And that little clearing is where the driveway ends. And so the thought is to kind of use that leveled spot as our access road getting into the park. We want to be able to get people in and distribute them kind of into the park so that they have access to the different offerings. And so these little sketches here are kind of showing you've got this little crowned roadbed here with swales on either side, and the thought would be we would add the road in there, but then have parking kind of off to the upper hand side and leave the lower swale to handle runoff from our new roadway. So it's kind of using something that was built years ago and building up on it, and hopefully that will minimize some of the disturbances, because as you can see, there's still not a lot of trees growing in that, which might suggest that when they put it in, it was a gravel base or something, that it wasn't friendly to trees. Structures is another major component. I think the existing house, I think the current thinking is the house will probably be demolished through a green recycling effort that was done similarly. I think it was at Rideout Playground. So, a large percentage of that house would be recycled. I think it's just impractical to try to use it where it is for public functions, and to move it. Some estimates were done, and it's really cost prohibitive to move it, and to consider it affordable when it would cost so much to move it. The town is considering a restroom facility for the park. This is the visitor center restroom, so it would be based on a similar footprint. I think the styling would be sort of more rustic to fit the park setting, but that's the current thinking. So there would be male, female, and I think it would also have a storage room as well as a family room as well. Just a couple examples of pictures. We're thinking maybe a couple pavilions. I chose this one because it was kind of rustic, but it doesn't have to necessarily look like that, but a couple pavilions sited throughout, as I said, that could be used for events. And then this is kind of that picture of a kind of a low-key boardwalk that we're thinking about as a shoreline walkway. And why are we thinking of that? As I showed you in the beginning, so much of the shoreline all through here is so steep and inaccessible, and it was one of the things the town first asked about was how can we prevent erosion? So it's sort of taking the site's worst feature and trying to solve it right up front. So the thought was if we could do a boardwalk along the waterfront here, wouldn't that be great to giving us access? And this is that point where I talked about right at the beginning of the Cove where we can get accessible walkways down to that. So you can have access here to the water that meets accessibility codes. You would have all this waterfront open to get out there and view the water, fish, boat, and so forth. And then these would be stair connections back up to the kind of the open space area. And a couple pictures on the right there, just kind of showing that we want to try to minimize our disturbance of that bank, sort of treat up front how we're going to get people are going to get down to the waterfront. If we give them ways and we give them something to do, we're not going to get a lot of foot trails down to the water. And then this is just a picture showing one of lots of different ways of how you could treat boardwalks. I kind of like this one for the benches, that we could picture benches being as part of the design where you could sit. Maybe there's sort of informal rails. Certainly rails will be one of those things that will be debated as to whether they're necessary or not, and that will somewhat depend on how high off the water it would sit. But that's the thinking of that. And then the utilities, as I mentioned, hopefully we can put the electric underground. We would have water, some minimal lighting for security. stormwater, probably some stormwater basins in places to treat stormwater. We'll be doing low impact design as much as we can. And then we don't have sewer really available to us. It's like 700 feet out to the road, which makes it pretty infeasible to do a gravity sewer. So what we've been discussing is these kind of compostable systems where, a couple pictures here, they look like a regular bathroom, but underneath the unit are these kind of compost chambers, and these are kind of proprietary systems. And I put these pictures in one because this is the Concord Country Club. And this one, I liked it because here you have a grade drop where it's accessed through the back. This one, it's sort of through a bulkhead doors. And these systems are maintained by a company that specializes in this. And it basically composts the system, and it's waterless, and that's part of the system is getting the water out is how it all works. I'm not an expert on it, but I read their literature. So it's kind of the thinking in terms of the restroom. That way it would prevent all that sort of work necessary to put a sewer system or a septic field in. And then finally we get to the conceptual options. And I'm going to run through real quick 2 options. And the interesting thing about this is we looked at how we could really mix things up, but because of all these constraints that I have gone through, it really dictates the way a lot of the site wants to work. So what we end up with are kind of 2 options that are kind of, one's a full build, kind of where we started with, and one is sort of a reduced version of that. Because one of the things we did here at the last meeting was, could there be more of the park left undisturbed? So I'm going to kind of show those 2 and see if you like, which one you might prefer. So here's the site. The green is the Bruce Freeman. I have trouble seeing that, sorry. That's the Bruce Freeman Trail. That would be its route. The white is the property border to give you kind of a sense of where everything is. So this is the access road we've talked about bringing in with the alignment, the new alignment coming off Commonwealth. It would go back just short of where that, I call it sort of the gravel or sand pit area. It's a real disturbed area. Where we would have a turnaround so that cars coming in could get back out. You don't want to have a dead-end situation where people are kind of figuring out how to park and turn around, because invariably what they do is they end up pulling into the woods and doing all that sort of thing. This would have parking distributed along it. Then there are sort of these main elements. The orange is like the restrooms. This would be the playground, kind of about where the house site is. This would be that shoreline walkway with like fishing pier and an accessible boat launch. And then this would be that beach area where the Cove is located, where you would be launching boats. And kind of, you'd have a central core of pathways tying all that together. The solid lines would be accessible, predominantly accessible walkways, utilizing the natural topography to get from parking to the restroom and down to the waterfront. Like a loop around the open space. And then you would have more natural path systems in the back. And what that all kind of looks like in a colored rendering is this. Kind of the keyed in pieces highlighting all that. And we've got some paper copies, and I can certainly go back to this. The second kind of option is, that was the full footprint. This is what I call the reduced footprint. It's not very glamorous, but it's essentially what it is. It starts with the road is shortened. Instead of going all the way back, we pull up here. So we're disturbing less of the forest area. The parking then is distributed as such, and we are reducing the amount of parking in this particular scheme, going from about 50 to about 34 parking spaces. Again, you'd have kind of your central core facilities, restroom, boardwalk, playground, beach area. The core pathways, again, by moving this back, we still have reasonable access down to drop off a kayak or a canoe and get it down to the beach area. What it does do is it expands the walking path part of this, sort of the undisturbed portion, going from about here out would be left more the way it is. So those are really the two main concepts. We looked at all kinds of different things about pulling access roads over and in, or putting playgrounds back in different locations. But I think for a lot of reasons these locations make a lot of sense. But I'd like to hear from the audience things you see that you like, you don't like. So that concludes my presentation. I think I'll turn it over to discussion. Do you have anything you'd like to add? Or? Okay. So we'll kind of turn it over for discussion. If you've got any comment, please come to the microphone. You become famous that way. If not, I'll be forced to ask questions. Great.
And this question is not to you because the housing part of the work was not part of your project. My name is Terry Rothermel, 330 Musketaquid Road. My question is to the town's staff group. Why are we looking at a map that doesn't talk much about housing?
Hi there. The charge for what we had through GPI and for this part of the parcel was to talk about the active recreation and open space plans, which is what we're working on. What we did put into GPI's contract was identifying where we could put the a home, any home, that would be consistent with what we had in our deed, which is that it was for one area. If you hold on one second, Erin, there's a photo that I gave you on a zip drive that has an image that may say Exhibit B or C. D, okay. Had to be one of them. This was the exhibit that was attached to the purchase and sale agreement and ultimately to the deed. And when it comes up, you'll see that this is the area that the sellers permitted the town to have up to one unit of housing on. So I just want you to see where that is.
Right in front of the mountains, right?
And it equates to a little over a half an acre. And so part of the plan that we had here that we discussed with GPI is essentially ensuring that if we were to put a house here or when we put a house here, that it would be able to be situated outside of the 25 and 50-foot buffer zones, and that it wouldn't look like it was crammed in just up against Commonwealth Ave, but would look like it has some type of backyard area. And so if you were to superimpose this image on top of either concept A or B that was presented tonight, you'll see that that does just that. And so that was sort of the limits of what we did as part of this plan, the development. My understanding is that the Affordable Housing Committee, which I believe that you're a part of, and the other housing groups in town would be responsible for perhaps putting in a CPC article or some other type of funding article in order to be able to develop this. But that is not part of our plan. We plan on keeping this area. The only thing we're doing there is hopefully getting rid of some of the invasives.
Well, if you think the housing groups have been told about this, that's not right. We have not been told about that role. And we have not been a part of this discussion. And we had a big part in the passage of the warrant article at town meeting. I understand that there's some, and your consultant quoted the fact, it looks like the best thing to do here is demolish. Early in the process, we at the Concord Housing Foundation let it be known that we would try to raise $100,000 to fix up the house. And I doubt that that's been used in the equation between tearing it down and moving it. I think the housing groups, and I speak for myself on this, were very frustrated that we had this as part of the warrant article. There's been nothing done by the town in your study, and we have not been involved. We've
May
been
I
shut
answer?
out.
That's not true.
Oh, it hasn't. Oh, okay. Who's been involved?
Well, I'd like not to get into a debate with you about this. I'm happy to meet with you offline.
No, I will not do that alone with you.
You don't need to. We've had several meetings where several members of different housing groups have been associated. I also have copies of 4 separate emails that were sent to which you were a recipient. But I'd like to call up perhaps Tom McKean, who can talk to you about that, because this has been discussed at more than one select board meeting at a public forum. And I'd also like to call up Ryan Orr, who's our facilities director, who worked with
Who did the estimating?
he and the Elizabeth Rust, who works for the Housing Foundation.
Right.
So, and we have an estimate, which we also discussed at an open meeting. So maybe Tom can come up first, and then Ryan, if you want to come up.
Tom McCain, I'm Select Board, Nishotic Road. Excuse me. When we were negotiating the purchase of this property, the sellers did not want it to become a development, and they told us that the price, I believe initially they were talking well over $1 million, and they felt that they were giving the town a bargain, if you will, with the ability to turn this into something that meant a great deal to them, which was a recreational area. So there was a lot of discussion about that. I don't think it came as any surprise, or it certainly shouldn't have, that there was going to be a limited. What was going to happen to the house itself, there was discussion about perhaps moving it, whether it was something that could be relocated, but it was never on the proposal that it would remain where it was and be rehabbed, because that would totally destroy the recreational aspect of this. I do have one question, as not speaking for the board, but speaking for myself, and I'm just wondering whether all of these paths and the handicap access aspect of it has been outlined and is going to be part of the development.
More than 50% of the paths that we propose will be accessible, yes. And once we have a plan that we can agree on and is finalized, I would hope to be able to go to the Disability Committee and discuss that, get their perspective. The idea is to get groups that know more about some of the certain elements to weigh in. So we're looking at going to the Natural Resources Commission, the Planning Board, Recreation Commission, and the Disability Commission to get their input. As far as the housing piece, I'm happy to say that we have a letter from Charles Phillips, from the president of the Concord Housing Foundation, that he wrote on September 6th after a select board meeting that reviewed the existing home, recognizing that the home can't stay where it is, acknowledging the town's ideas to move it, thanking the town for working with them in trying to move it, and understanding that the relocation may be part of the plan but could be cost prohibitive, and thanking for us for trying to find a location on the current property which would be conducive to a family-style home.
Has your team reached out to housing people to be involved in this planning?
Yes.
I believe this is planning.
I'm sorry.
This is planning, isn't it?
Yes, we had a meeting, myself, I believe the town manager was there, members of the Housing Corporation and the Housing Authority were there. Elizabeth Rust was there. The Director of Planning and Land Management, Marcia Rasmussen, was there. And our Planning Director was there to get an idea and actually go over the estimate that was made on moving the house. So we have been pretty involved with some of the housing folks. And again, you know, I'd like to be able, Mr. Athamel, to talk about some of the other merits of this as well.
There were no questions about that, okay?
Pardon?
There were no questions about that, so I'm raising a housing issue.
Okay.
I have one more question.
Yep.
Probably 6 months ago or so, the hearing was held and we raised questions about why housing was not considered on this property from the get-go. And it was not as our policies in town require. Now, you've just mentioned the groups that got together to represent housing. Those are two of the three groups. The group that raised the question in the first place was our Concord Housing Foundation and myself. So at that meeting, the plan about housing, we have the Housing Authority and the CHCD, but no one from our place. And I'm saying that that's not right.
I'm saying you're incorrect.
Oh, were we there?
Was I there?
Were we there?
The initial, the initial meeting that we had with the housing group, your particular group was represented. You had a member there that's a member of the select board now that was at the CPC hearing when we went in and discussed it. I'm happy to talk about this with you offline, but this is about park planning, the planning. Your comments are registered. I understand.
Well,
I'm happy to give you the information, but I'd like to answer any other questions about the
I will
park.
after I'm finished. I think we need to move post-haste on something planned for that house or some other house. And I think the arithmetic from Ryan, whoever has done the work, needs to be shared widely, because I suspect that $100,000 of raised money is not in the equation for moving the house.
Ryan, would you like to come up and give a brief overview?
Ryan Orr, Facilities Director for town. Yeah, so I spent a little bit of time looking at the property myself and looking at the house. And, I mean, from a distance, the house looks great. But the siding, number one, is not something that we can replace pieces of. It's going to have to be fully resided. It's going to need a new roof. The windows that are existing in the house are storm windows. None of this, I think, would be acceptable for housing, for low-income housing. A lot of it's gonna have to be brought up to code. I mean, $100,000 is great, but I see that between moving the house, putting a new foundation in, septic, whatever we need to put into it to get it there, we're looking at well over $300,000. So it just, to me, I don't see $100,000 as being enough money to make this feasible. So, that's it.
Thank you.
Hi, Susan Melodizenic, 392 Border Road. I have a couple questions about, well, just one question really about dredging the pond and what effect that has on the ecosystem, kind of in that general area if the pond is dredged. And then secondly, I was wondering what is actually on the other side of the pond that isn't shown in the schematics?
Okay. Yes, sure. Oh, either one. Whatever you want.
Hi, Kristen Sabaski with ESS Group. So for the dredge program, that's actually, just so you know, not for the entire pond. It's kind of, there's a particular area. I don't know if we want to pull up the figure of the pond. It would make it helpful. But so basically in the area that it's going to be dredged, that is going to hopefully for a certain number of years take care of the aquatic invasive species in that area. And I guess if we have, Yeah, like the, yeah, there's a slide that has the two figures with the bathymetry and the sediment depths that shows the whole pond. It's not totally important, but, so, that will help in terms of having kind of a variety of habitats, and also as part of the dredge program, we're looking at potentially doing some kind of wetland creation, like a wetland shelf off of Scout Island. So does that answer your question, or are you looking for more information? Okay. What was the second part of your question? Sorry.
What was on the other side of the pond that's not shown in the drawings?
Oh.
If you want a laser pointer. It's hard to see, but that's a laser pointer right there.
Okay. Yeah, so the area for dredging is actually, where is it? Oh, okay. Kind of down in this area. And then you're asking what's on the other side of the pond?
I guess maybe I thought the pond was a big circle, but now it doesn't look like that anymore.
Oh, yeah, so the area that's colored in is the entire pond. This is Scout Island, and so the Boy Scouts own that island. And there's kind of a big kind of wetland area that leads in over on this side, and then the outlet is down this way. So.
Hello.
Hi, Dee Ortner, 169 Thoreau Street. I have a few questions. The first one is, can you tell me what you anticipate the capacity of this site, this recreational site, is?
I think the capacity is one of the things we're trying to get at, like in terms of parking, you mean, or?
In terms of people who would be at the site on a Saturday afternoon, in a hot Saturday afternoon.
Yeah, that's, I think it's a difficult number to arrive at. It's like predicting how many people are going to show up before you build something. But it's like, like the schemes are like we've estimated, like the Fuller one is 50 cars. So there's 50 cars that people could come in, whether it's one person or four, And then there's the bike paths. So there's any number of people that can get there via bike path. I think you're talking anywhere from on a quiet day, 20, 30 people to maybe, several hundred during the peak seasons.
Is there any other park that you can compare this to? What about the other one in West Concord? Rideout? Yeah, can you describe what the capacity is there, what the number of people who are typically there, how would that...
I'll let Ryan address that a little. They're very
Okay.
different because Rideout is, ball fields and
But that's the
playgrounds.
only one in town at the moment, right?
It's true.
Ryan Kane, Director of Recreation. A little difficult to answer. We're at White's Pond. We were talking capacity numbers because there are standards set for bathing based on the number of footage for the beach.
The beach.
That would make
That's
sense.
400. I know,
Yeah,
talked
so
about
the-
that
so
at
the-
town meeting.
So
But
there are
what-
standards set for something like that where a
Right.
general park capacities are very hard to, if you go to old Shea Stadium, you're driving through New York City and you go through the parks, you realize their capacities are a lot different than most other park capacities. It's really based on kind of people coming and getting to that comfort level and staying and satisfying through that. So we wouldn't have a number. There's not a national average.
Okay, but
that-
what's the parking capacity over at Rideout?
Parking numbers, 54 spots in the new
54
parking lot. In the new parking lot.
in the
of
new
Rideout.
parking
You do
lot,
have some
right, I
parking
know.
lots off of there.
Right,
Yeah,
you have
and-
54 there,
Yeah.
okay. So I'm just wondering if and Rideout is a much smaller space, I think?
Rideout's a much
Is Rideout
larger space,
bigger?
yeah.
Okay, oh, interesting. Okay, so I'm just wondering, with the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail and people on bikes, and the bridge over Route 2 isn't going to happen for quite a few years, so it really dead ends right here. And with that, and then people wanting to come to this, I just have concerns about parking capacity, about people capacity, about management of this site, And we're looking at planning this, and I haven't heard any information associated with what's the management component associated with this plan. Is that the lead-in for you or something? So it's just, yeah, it just seems that we're looking at something and you want opinions of something, you know, this plan, but I don't have the information that I really need in order to say, should it be option 1, option 2?
So I couldn't agree more. One of the things that Ryan Kane and I did this year is that we set up and asked for the Finance Committee to give us a mock budget, so a TBA line item that talks about parks and playground maintenance. And we took it as the changes that we made to Ride Out in the last 2 fiscal years, the addition of White Pond, and the hopeful completion of this project, and what that would take in terms of FTEs or full-time equivalents and sort of person hours for in all seasons. And what we came up with was a proposal that we would like to have 2 full-time equivalent park maintainers that are under the facilities division that can work both with whatever infrastructure we build here, but also do some of the less routine maintenance, so not the grass mowing, not the tree trimming that our parks crew already does, but things that aren't done, including, you know, maintaining the boardwalk that's here, the beach, maintaining a public bathing beach, taking care of all of the properties that right now aren't on the Parks and Trees divisions, not under their auspices. And then we also talked about doing park and recreation programming to pay for a half-time seasonal person that would work somewhere between 12 and 14 weeks out of the year, perhaps a college student that's home for the summer, or some type of park maintainer that could work during those really busy seasons, halfway between Gerow and White Pond. So maybe starting one day at one facility and ending their day at another, and then switching for the following days.
So this is all predicated on having both of these parks fully open and accessible?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so how long will it take us to get to that point in terms of your phased approach for the Gerow property?
So the Gerow property really depends on funding. What we have done so far is to put in a community preservation application, which Ryan and I will be going and talking about in the upcoming weeks, and we're ever hopeful that will rise to the top of the funding list in and amongst many other very worthwhile projects. And I recognize that many are, you know, kind of scrounging for the same money, so we're at the mercy there. And we've also put in a couple of grant applications, so we don't know about that. And I also put in a request for capital money, which would be funded through an acceptance at town meeting this April, which would be for fiscal year 20. And we put in some design and construction monies for that. So realistically, should all those things pass, we would be in Fat City, but I'm not quite sure all of them are going to pass. So we would have to figure out initially how much money are we going to get, and then take a phased approach. And it could be very possible that we take the condensed version and use that, and perhaps we go to the expanded version. So, for example, could you go to B or number 2? I forget what we're calling it here, but the condensed version. So based on the experience that Ryan had in the last 12 months with the Ride Out project, it seems that asphalt and paving seems to far outweigh the cost of most others. So given that this is a more condensed version, this might be the less expensive option of the two. So it could be that we start with something like this and then see that perhaps we don't have enough parking, or we're seeing a need for more, and then work something into the budget to expand that parking, much like item number A was.
So if you work on the asphalt first, does that mean the park would not open until you at least have a roadway and you have the circular, the roundabout or return?
We
Is
don't-
that correct?
We don't need the roundabout to open a park by any means. It's more aesthetically pleasing, and I think it's easier for people.
Well, I've walked on that roadway before, and it's not terribly wide. Do you really think that you can get two cars back and forth at the same time? No.
No, we
So
need to
already you
widen.
have a problem.
We need to widen the road for sure. Yep. So there's a lot that needs to be done for that. I don't. I think that we're going to generate enough money and we're going to raise enough money to be able to get into the park, have some small parking facility, and do some improvements that the community will think is major, that aren't terribly, expensive to be able to utilize it. The thought is, if we don't get all of the funding that we need in the first year or so, that we're able to sort of generate some interest in the park to say, and now we're going to raise money for X, now we're going to raise money for Y. But yes, certainly getting into the park, parking, and having some actual usage of it would be priority number one.
Okay, so then you still have to have the people there who are going to be the maintenance people. But I
Correct.
guess I'm just wondering, is this, instead of looking at concept 2, if you looked at concept 1, and you could you go to concept 1 slide, please, just for a minute? And I just wonder, what could you do if you took a 3-year approach to this, or a 5-year approach to the build-out of this? Could you describe how that would occur?
Sure. So the thought would be to make the simple connections, maybe not as many, but a couple from the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail onto the property, to have the drive-in with some parking, to clear out the invasive species and do some of the tree canopy trimming so that we can make sure that some of the area that's more robust with trees and whatnot is able to be there to
That's okay. You're giving me, you're giving me a good,
to be able
idea
to,
of how
we
you-
also were talking about
moving it out.
recycling the home, so taking
Yeah.
pieces of the home and recycling that, and that actually saves a little bit of money on the demo. To be able to use that more as an open meadow, so grading, seeding, loaming there. I don't necessarily think that first phase, depending on funding, may include any pavilion, restroom, playground, big site amenities, but I think that you could see a field, some open space, parking, an access road, certainly enough for emergency lighting and that kind of stuff, and then being able to kind of,
Still have to bring in electric, and you were still.
well, we have electric there.
You have the
Yeah,
utilities there.
that's good.
Okay.
And there is a well, so we would be able to have some kind of public well water source.
I'll stop my questions now. It's just that I really didn't feel as though I had much information in terms of if I would vote concept. I would vote concept 1. It might not get there all at one time, but if you have a phased approach to getting to concept 1, that should be an alternative as well.
Okay, that's great. That's really good feedback. Thank you.
Hi, Jeff Collins, 55 Highland Street, the current chair of the West Concord Advisory Committee, and the committee's thrilled with this whole project, but just had a few thoughts on my own. So I agree with that phased approach that was discussed a little bit at the August meeting, sort of build it, see who comes. I think they will come, and then if there's a budget and energy or design to grow from there and accommodate more uses, that's exciting. In concept 1 here, the parking nearest to Commonwealth Ave is on the south side of a widened driveway, and on concept 2, it's on the north side. If we can jump down there. And I imagine that's shown, just a few different elements of the sketch to see different ways we could play with it. I think the greater buffer we can retain between the parking and active use and the rail trail will draw people to designated crossings among those and not a lot of informal crossing between the two, and retain. I also if I read your photograph, or I was placing myself in your photograph appropriately, that showed the sort of that old forested road.
Yeah.
It seemed to rise up towards the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail on the north side. You're relatively flat. On
There's actually, through those woods, there's sort of like almost like a series of terraces. There's 2 or 3 of them where it kind of rolls up and then it's kind of flat and it rolls up. And that one's like one of the upper ones. So, you know, as we would get into final kind of the nitty gritty design, we'd be looking at how we can kind of tie into the land and disturb as little as possible, but work with those grades. Right. So, yeah, I'm sure, be the experts on this, but it just occurred to me, it appeared to me that parking on the south side would involve less soil movement, et it's
cetera.
possible, or you could shift the road so that the parking is in the old road and the road is a little further down. We've kind of, on the parking, whether it's on the trail side or on the park side, we've shown on the first option, we've shown it as it's both, because we felt like where it's by the open space and you've got the playgrounds and lots of kids, that we felt like you wanted them to kind of be able to get out of the car and get right over to it. Where it was up by the sort of the boat launch area, we kind of figured you pull in with your pickup truck or your station wagon. People still drive station wagons. And you unload your boat, and it's part of it is trying to convey a park look versus a standard parking lot. So we kind of like sometimes flipping the parking. That the road is fairly quiet, that if you're walking in the road, that's not necessarily a bad thing because it keeps people slower. To your point, we are showing it here with predominant amount of parking on the trail side and just a little area here to make sure we're getting an accessible space. And here we're toying with an idea, and this is something I've seen on past jobs, where maybe there's a few people want to sit in their car, have a coffee, and actually never get out of their car. So that's one of the few locations where you might be able to get a glimpse of the pond, because when you sit in the driveway here, you cannot see the pond because the ground rises up to where the house is.
I love the extent of the shoreline walk that's shown in Concept 1.
Yeah.
And that seems compatible with Concept 2 as well, obviously
driven
by budget, among
other
other
things. We scaled it down here as much because thinking if it were too much for people, but also it almost is, if option 1 is the way people go, this is almost sort of an inkling of what a phasing plan might look like. And this is something that we have talked about is, you know, building all this infrastructure that you really need to build the road as one of the first components, because as someone mentioned, that driveway is awfully narrow. It's for a single family house that you need to be able to at least have cars be able to pass. So you need to build that piece of the road. It's not glamorous, but it's the things that make the park work.
Just 2 final points. One, the concept of the alternative entrance to the site is very exciting, and I hope we can make that happen. Mm-hmm. And in terms of, you mentioned the forest condition and maybe some alterations that could encourage understory regeneration. I would assert that it's deer browse as much as anything else, and that the forest can do what it'll do. But the whole concept, elements of it look great.
Great, thank you. Hello.
Hi, I'm Terry Ackerman. I'm the chairperson of the CPC committee. And I have a question for town officials, especially select board, recreation, and maybe planning. And I know you don't know the answer yet, but we have 3 different applications in front of us right now that have boat launches. This being one of them, and White Pond another. And then as part of the dredging for Warner's Pond, I believe there's a $200,000 being requested for improved access on Com Ave. So we need to make some recommendations pretty early in the process, and we're looking for a sense of priorities from the different town officials. Maybe not yet tonight. If you know tonight, great. But certainly by, say, Thanksgiving, because we need to take our votes right after that. Thanks.
So I will passionately plead the case for the two that I submitted, although I do believe that the Warner's Pond one is equally as important. So the Gerow area, the CPC application that we put in was for a phase to include an access road and some accessible pathways. We weren't necessarily asking for money for the actual boat launch, because while it would be great if we got all the funding, in 1 year, I don't necessarily believe that's realistic. And so some informal boat launch may happen. We encourage it. I would really love that. But I don't think that that would be something we would consider to do with the first pile of money that we get. As far as White Pond, what we put the CPC application in was for an accessible pathway down to the water from the parking area. We actually weren't dealing with the boat launch for a couple of reasons. One, because we need to deal with a drainage issue that's going on there. And the second one is because that actually belongs to the state right now. And so one of the things that we're talking with the state about is giving us the authority and the ability to be able to own that. But first, we would like them to fix it. So they're giving it to us, pretty much in pristine condition, or as near pristine condition as we can get, and then we would maintain it as such. So we don't want them to give us a problem. We'd like them to give it to us well. So the application that we put in for White Pond doesn't include the boat launch, and the dredging, although that was put in by the Natural Resources Director, is really for the dredging portion of it, for both that public boat launch off Commonwealth Ave and that part of Gerow. I'm not necessarily sure that the application gets into maintaining the boat launch, but I could be wrong. You would know better.
I believe it includes $200,000 for improved access via Commonwealth Avenue. But I guess it's not just a boat launch,
Okay.
although I picked that as an example. But I guess we're looking for whether Recreation and the Select Board and other groups would prefer, let's say, a little bit of money for each project, or whether you prefer we get a lot of phase one done, let's say for Gerow, and then another year do White Pond. So we're looking for a real sense.
Is a lot of money for all three projects not an option? No? Okay,
I'm-
just checking.
We have other
I have
projects
to
as
ask.
well. We would love to do all of them, and we also have other projects too. So yeah,
Of course, yeah.
we need some kind of sense of priorities from the different town
Yep.
groups, obviously.
So as far as recreation is concerned, and my office is concerned, I look at the Gerow recreation area and the White Pond recreation area very differently. I know that swimming is a component of both. Swimming is the primary function at the White Pond area, whereas Gerow has a bunch of different things that could be there, including a great deal of passive recreation, some ideas that are just sort of tying in that Bruce Freeman Rail Trail, the proximity to the West Concord downtown. That's a very different feel than the White Pond, whereas the biggest issue to White Pond is making sure that every resident has equal access to that. And right now, that's very, very difficult. So we're not having an access issue at Gerow, and we are to White Pond. So it's very difficult for me, just individually, and me also as the town's ADA director, to say, I'm going to put a multi-use recreational facility above having access to public bathing beach. I would say that they're equal. But that's only because I don't represent the other CPC applications, which I think you're going to get many other department heads and division managers who are going to advocate just as passionately. So I do not envy your decision at all.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Hi, Court Booth, 144 Wright Road. I'm speaking as a interested neighbor to this project. I'll echo a point I tried to make at town meeting and say that I hope the town recognizes that we're building a regional asset here. We're not building a town asset by virtue of its location. I am concerned that we're overlooking that fact. This tonight was called a master plan. I hope, in fact, it's a master plan in progress. We've talked about piecemeal, we've talked about phasing, and I can see why that would be necessary from a cost perspective. I'm not sure it'd be wise to be piecemeal from a planning perspective. I think we need to look at this as comprehensively as we can, and as we're starting to do tonight, more in concert with White Pond and other assets. I think to look at them systemically is critical. You mentioned equal access. Around my kitchen table, we've tried to do the math. There's 6,000 plus homes in this town. And at town meeting, we said we have room for 400 people at White Pond, or 400 families. So we're going to be quite challenged to produce anything that would be considered equal access. In terms of this property, just a concern about the plans for use. We already have staffing plans, which you stated, but we're unable to come up with potential usage, volume, or load on the property. So I question, where do we get these numbers for staff if we don't have numbers for busy days there? So I would ask us to pause and check some of these numbers and share some more numbers. In terms of the clearing of the pond, I'm told that in the old days, what the town would do is lower the water level, let the ice freeze on the bottom, open up Laws Brook, float the ice, and take everything out with the ice, which of course was an environmental disaster because it took out the good with the ill. My question about the pond is, are we finding much lead there from the old pail factory? Because there was, at one point, a considerable amount of lead getting dumped into that pond. That's why it's called Warner's Pond. So just a question. And we also have an old dump that is adjacent to that pond. What that's leaching, we don't know either, although it's not next to this property. I don't know on this drawing where the burial ground is, but I wonder if we suddenly have a regional asset here with lots of folks that we want there, and we do want them. I get that. I'm all for it. I love the project, but I want to make sure it's done right. That's the burial ground.
That's the burial ground over there.
Okay. Because what is a unknown burial ground is going to be a known burial ground as soon as we have high usage at the place. So I'm curious what the state has to say about that.
Well, just so you know, we commissioned a Phase 1 report, which we actually asked them to test some of the pits up there just to make sure that there were no contaminants in the soil, and one of them is because of the proximity to what we say is a deactivated burial ground. My understanding is they haven't buried someone there for several decades, but they did come back clear. If we were ever going to do anything that was really environmentally invasive, we would follow up with a Phase 2, which is what we do if we have to bore holes fairly far down.
But that won't be necessary.
I would think not, because we're not going to be constructing anything that's, you know, within 30 to 50 feet of where the edge of that ground is. But of course, I can't control or even foresee what may happen 50, 60, 70 years down the line.
Right, but what I'm trying to convey is we have to do as much foreseeing as we possibly can, because this is going to be a commitment we're making for generations to come.
May I ask you a question?
Sure.
You had said something at the beginning about foreseeing being a regional asset, and you weren't sure if we took that into account. Was that relating to parking or something else that you don't think we've considered?
I'm not claiming that you're not taking things into account.
I didn't
What
take
I'm
offense. I'm
claiming
just
is
curious.
I don't think it's visible enough to everybody that this is going to be a wonderful magnet for the Bruce Freeman Trail, rail trail, which is a wonderful asset that is getting busier and more popular, and rightfully so, every day. And we're going to be the first people that plunk a big parking lot effectively on Route 2 for the rail trail. And I simply think we've got to bear in mind all of those potential consequences. And yeah, we'll call them potential because we don't exactly know, but we've got to give these things our best guess.
Yeah, it's a good
Otherwise,
point.
how can we staff it or budget it We've got to do it for some kind of defensible predictions.
And I just wanted to answer your other comment about the projection that we had for staff estimates. So the way that we do park estimates as far as full-time equivalents is based on the work that they'll do and not the amount of people that are there, which is a little bit different than the way that you would do conventional active recreation. So we do acreage, and acreage that needs to be mowed, acreage that needs to be weeded, acreage that would need any pruning, ornamental trees versus regular pines, and then any blazed trails. And so what I did was take the most robust plan that we had and basically measure it out in linear feet, which we did it on a, thanks to GPI, on their drawn to scale plan, and basically estimated at prevailing wage. What is prevailing wage? So the estimate is arguably 20% higher than what we may need, but I assume if we're going to save 20% on personnel, that we would probably make that up in whatever we need to buy for material.
Okay.
So it came out to about two full-time people.
Implied in that, as I hear it, Kate, is that we're going to wrap a lot of the other services into existing departments and staff.
Yes, I think,
Okay,
yeah, I think we're
so-
getting very good at that.
And I think we need to quantify that.
Absolutely.
I think we need to quantify that, because that also is a cost we're going to bear. And it's going to fall to town departments to produce results beyond what you described just then. And finally, and I wish Mr. Rothermel were still here, I think many people in this town share his passion for affordable housing. I think an equal number, and probably the same people, share a passion for recreational preservation. And the amount of land we have under preservation is almost unequaled in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts as a percentage of our land area. I personally, granted I'm not as informed as I'd like to be, but I think that putting both debates into one property, both efforts at great solutions for affordable housing and great recreation onto the same plot simply because it's a timely argument might be a mistake. And I would hope that we do affordable housing very well in this town, continue to, and that we do community preservation and recreation very well. Whether those debates need to get played out on one piece of property, I question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. Okay. Hi. So I'm Amy Kaiser. I live at 294 Commonwealth Ave, and I'm a member of the West Concord Advisory Committee, but I'm just speaking for myself as a neighbor this evening. I'm very excited about this project. I'm excited that the town is conducting this effort. And I think both concepts are great, have lots of great ingredients. So I appreciate the opportunity to see them, and also the opportunity, what was it, like 3 weeks ago, a month ago, to walk the site. My couple comments at first impression of these were first of all, I guess I lean towards concept 2, because having walked some of that land, it's just so beautiful back there. There's something lovely about keeping as much of it as we can undisturbed rather than running a road through it. So I lean in that direction, certainly interested to hear others' thoughts on that. The other thing I'm thinking about, and I'm certainly, whether they're in the first phases or later stages, I'm very excited about that notion of a boardwalk at the site, a playground. Those things I think would be great additions to the neighborhood and to this site. One thing I've been thinking about as I've been hearing folks talking and looking at these plans is parking. And I think maybe I had the opposite first reaction of some of my neighbors and thinking, wow, I wonder if, as we think about parking available already for the Bruce Freeman Trail, as well as parking informally available just, at the edge of the site plan at the prison, if we really need to, take down additional trees to provide yet more parking. And maybe there's a strategy that could be phased over time. Maybe that number would be even better at 25 or a lower number with the ability to build in additional capacity if we need it, especially as I think about, the comparison was made to Rideout Playground, and that place, on a great summer night in June with like 4 teams all playing baseball and families there, and that parking lot just full of kids, 50 spaces is great. And I do hope people will, ride to the park. There's certainly lots of great bike access here. So those were my initial thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Rich Feely, 347 Lexington Road. I am on the board of the Concord Housing Foundation, but this is essentially a personal statement. A quick observation, a quick question, and 2 suggestions. And the observation is we were very pleased at the first walkthrough to see the affordable house site on the plans. And there's an old saying that you don't have to be paranoid to think that people are out to get you. The fact that it's totally fallen off these 2 drawings makes me concerned that it's also fallen down the town's priority list. So that leads me to my question, which is, from the point of view of our planners, have you found any regulatory obstacles to putting either the moved or new house on the area of the property that was agreed with the Gerows?
The only thing that we have found that may be an obstacle is the drive that you see on both plans requires that we change the easement that we have with the state on the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail to be able to cross over. That's a 99-year lease. There is a possibility, although slim, that Mr. Hedrick talked about, that it could be that after 99 years they want that small easement back, and then we would be essentially landlocked and unable to be able to access the park. So the thought would be, if we were going to move ahead with a housing site, that we would have some type of land lease with that between the town and whomever, perhaps for $1, same amount of time, the 99 years, that says that should the easement with the state be taken back and we need to have access, that we would work in conjunction together to come up with some kind of plan to access the park. Other than that,
Town could always take some, or the state could always take it by eminent domain. I mean, if that's what you need to do, I think 100 years is beyond, starting to push the useful life of any house you put on that site. So that leads me to my 2 suggestions. Number 1, please include in everything you're doing getting this site ready to put a house on it. I mean, if we're going to clear invasives, then let's, level it or do whatever we have to do to, connect it to the sewer system or prepare for a septic tank or whatever. So please integrate that in the planning instead of just pushing it off and only looking at the recreational part. I realize it takes money to move or build a house, but let's integrate that in the site planning. My second question is, if we're a year or 2 years or 3 years from doing something, why don't we rent the house?
Hi.
Hi.
Gary Kleiman, 57 Central Street in West Concord, and chairman of the planning board, but I think based on some of the responses I have to some other comments I heard tonight, I'm probably speaking as the former chair of the Long Range Plan Committee. First, I don't know if she's still here, from the CPC, for the first, I'd say 9 months or 10 months of the long range plan effort, the 18-month effort that we had, or 24-month effort we had, the second most popular comment on the Envision Concord website, for the entire first half of the plan was the likes about increasing access to waterfront in West Concord. I think there's huge pent-up demand for increasing access to all of the waterfronts in West Concord. Now, whether you consider White Pond, West Concord, or South Concord, I don't know, but I'm not surprised that there are 3 proposals coming to CPC that in some ways will increase access to the waterfront areas of Western and Southern Concord. So I think it's great that we have these proposals. I agree that it's going to be a really challenging decision for you guys, but I hope you do find money for all 3, because I think it would be great. I think Court had to leave, but I totally agree with his comments that this is going to be a regional project, not just a town project. And I think that that is fully appropriate based on, again, our long-range plan where we as a town embrace responsible regionalism. And we are trying to build connections with our neighboring towns, Acton and others. And I think we should be putting forward a plan that can accommodate people and welcoming people who come along the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail. And I see it doing that. I think he was saying the same thing. So I don't think that's in conflict, but he's probably right. We should be planning for that. And in that vein, we might think about more bike racks on the site as well as parking spots. Amy, I just agree with what Ms. Kaiser said. I actually prefer Concept 2 to Concept 1. I love maintaining more of the natural area. And I also agree with a comment that was made earlier about the extension of the boardwalk. It's fine if it's a phased approach and maybe we start with a shorter boardwalk, but I think that, again, increasing the access to the waterfront is going to be the real highlight. And so having that longer boardwalk, as much as this is going to be our visual master plan that we may only achieve in stages, I would represent it now. And to that degree, I guess we probably ought to include the affordable house on there also, because I think you want to show the full plan that we're aiming towards, even if it only does get developed in stages. And the last thing that I had was just picnic tables. A little thing, but you listed a bunch of the activities there. You never said picnicking. Is there a plan for picnic tables? I think you ought to have a couple.
So there is a plan that isn't necessarily shown here for smaller site amenities, which we can absolutely integrate and probably should, because I think when we talk about parks, we think that everybody just assumes, but that isn't the correct assumption. So picnic tables, bike racks, water fountains, maybe a dog run somewhere, in the woods. Just asking a question of you. So would you, Erin, do you mind going back to Concept 1? Would you take Concept 1's boardwalk, wherever that may be, and sort of superimpose that on Concept B's parking plan and paved plan? Is that, so it would be 2B?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back, if you go back to 2, it has almost the identical boardwalk there. You just only have half of it. So I would extend the boardwalk further down and have
like
a path.
1. So it's about so the Concept 2's boardwalk is about half as much. 1 comes out to right about where Ron is pointing that red.
Yeah. So I would extend it down to there and have a cut through.
Okay.
On the master plan.
That's great.
Exactly at half. I cut it exactly at half for this.
So this by no means is the final. I think what we are going to try to do is take the feedback that we have this evening, coupled with the feedback we got from the first meeting, and then we're also going to be doing an online series where we are lucky enough that Minuteman Media Network was taping us live tonight, and hopefully we'll play it a couple other times so folks who couldn't come out would take a look, and we'll try to have a couple of online polls. So we'll make sure to communicate that to West Concord Advisory Board and the Select Board and CPC and all other interested parties, the housing folks. I agree with you. We can try to superimpose a place where the house could go. I think that would be helpful to understand that. And maybe, a connection to the driveway so you can kind of see how it's oriented. As far as preparing the site and invasives, we absolutely are planning on doing that as part of, one of the earlier phases. I think as a dual purpose, 1, to have the site be ready, but 2, to make sure that access is open, accessible, and also visible. For emergency services, and so that was a very good suggestion, and I think would be helpful. And I guess in the meantime, if you or anybody else knows of any other comments that you might like to have, if you could email us, Ryan Kane is going to be putting all of this information, the PowerPoint presentation, both concepts, and the meeting minutes from last meeting that we had in August up on the Recreation Department's website under the commission where it says active projects. So that stuff will be there, and we'll also put a link to where you could rewatch if you're so inclined. Yes?
A quick suggestion on the developing of this master plan. You could color code these 13 items as phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. That would give more information to people who've asked about what would be first.
It's a great idea. Okay, great, great. I know this is an unofficial poll, but is there anyone in the room that would offer the concept 1 as their chosen? So let me tell you, there's going to be concept 1, concept 2 as is, and then concept 2B, which is 1's boardwalk, but with 2's other parking and infrastructure. So if an unofficial show of hands, you can change your mind. For concept 1? Okay. And 2? And then 2B, which you have to see in your imagination. Okay. Okay, that's great. That's great. All right. Are there any other questions? Anything that Ron can answer? I would just ask, if you wouldn't mind, if you didn't already, if you could sign in, because we'll make sure that we put your email on the list so we can tell you when new links are uploaded or anything else. And the final concept and some type of schematic for how much it's going to cost and how we're going to phase it would be at a future select board meeting. And we're hoping to have that before the end of the year. But we will make sure to publicize that heavily, and certainly we'll be sending that information out by email to everyone that signed in, but feel free to spread that around as well. And I thank you, everybody, for coming out and missing the Sox game.